彼らのように気が触れていたのですね。どうしてなのか自分でも分かりません。
考えるのを後にして、とにかく後始末だ。そこの死体を片付けて部屋の掃除だ。
ああ、この畳はもうダメだな。
こっちの襖も変えなきゃだぜ。
Each of them moved to begin some task that needed doing, and Hijikata turned towards her.
それとお前は怪我人を引っ込んでろ。体を休めるのが先だ。と言ってもこの部屋は使えねえか。今夜のとこは俺の部屋を使ってろ。しょうがねえだろう。さっさと行け。
She had no desire to remain in the blood-soaked room any longer than she had to. It took her only minutes to reach Hijikata's room. The sun was peeking through the window, and outside she could hear twitters and chirps of birdsong. The room she was in wasn't hers. It took her a moment to remember whose room it was, and then all the events of the previous night crowded back into her memory. She saw, vividly, the man who'd gone mad with bloodlust, felt the sting of his sword as it bit into her arm. She looked down at her arm. She'd wrapped it in bandages the night before, after insisting that she could handle it herself, being the daughter of a doctor. Slowly she lifted it, then moved it in a circle. The cut had bled a lot, but fortunately it hadn't been particularly deep. She moved her arm some more. It didn't hurt. With deliberate care, she unwrapped the bandages. What had been an ugly open wound the night before was now little more than a faint white line. In a few days, even that would be gone. After some thought, she rewrapped the bandages. Unless they took them off, no one would know that her arm was completely healed underneath. That reminded her, however. How were they doing? She was awake, so she figured she might as well go out to the common room and see if anyone was there. As she neared the entrance, Ito appeared, on his way out. Heisuke and Saito followed in his wake, much to her confusion.
ああ、君ですか。おはよう。命が助かったようで何よりですわね。
His mood was almost polar opposite of the previous night. He seemed now to be in rather high spirits.
知りたい？教えない。ま、君にもすぐにわかりますわ。ねえ、東堂くん、斉藤くん。
She cocked an eyebrow at Heisuke and Saito.
まあな。
The moment their eyes met, he looked away. That seemed odd.
今は知る必要はないということだ。
Unlike his companion, Saito met her gaze straight on, but his eyes were flat and utterly devoid of any emotion.
行きましょう、伊藤さん。平助も行くぞ。ああ、じゃあまたな。
And then they were gone, leaving her wondering just what had happened.
おや、もう起きてて大丈夫なのかい？
Inoue and Shimada looked up as soon as she stepped into the common room.
それはよかった。しかし災難でしたね。傷が痛んだりしませんか？
She couldn't tell him the truth, of course, that it was already almost completely healed.
そうかい。あったのかい。
He frowned.
実は伊藤さんたちはここから出ていくことになったんですよ。
新しく隊を立てるらしい。新選組とは別に。
近藤局長と土方副長が伊藤さんと話し合って決めたことですから。
五両英治だって？
いかにもこの伊藤同志と共にここを出て孝明天皇の御両絵寺を拝命する所存ですわ。前々から考えていたのですけれど、あんな場面を見せられてしまったのですから、ちょうどいい機会だと思いまして。もともと尊王攘夷の志を持って新選組に協力しておりましたけれど、あなたたちとはどうにも水が合わなかったようですし。
理屈はいい。伊藤さん、あんた要するに体を割ろうって言うんだろう。
体を割るも何も、あなたたちのような獣の集団と一緒にいられませんわ。
まあ伊藤さんがそこまで言うならしょうがない。だが説明したように今回の事件の大元は幕府の依頼なのだ。今回のことを外に漏らされては我々も黙っているわけにはいかない。
そこは取引というものですわ。あなたたちは黙っていてほしいし、私たちは出て行きたい。だから出るにあたって大使を分けてほしいと言っているのよ。
分かった。だが連れて行くからには本人の承諾をお願いしますよ。
それはもちろんですわ。表向きは協力関係にあるという形を取らせていただきますし、その方がお互いにとっても都合がよろしいじゃないかしら。
協力体制ね。ということだそうだ。トシ、これでいいかい？
近藤さんがそう決めたなら俺はもう何も言わねえよ。
伊藤さんについていくそうだよ。驚いたね。
Then, would that mean she could never see them again?
案ずることはない。言っただろう。これは友好的な関係を前提とした分離だ。
It was kind of him to try and comfort her, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was going to befall the Shinsengumi and its members.
そうは言っても、今後はエジと新選組大使との交流は禁止するつもりだろう。
The expression on his face was likely a mirror of her own.
当然だ。これ以上あいつらの好き勝手にさせるつもりはねえからな。伊藤派が抜けたところで困ることはない。
Hijikata's voice was flat, but unconcerned.
平助と斎藤も一緒だっていうのは少しばかり計算外だったか
な。少しどころではないな。
From there, the conversation moved on to a discussion of politics and the like that was beyond her ability to follow. And what could she have said anyway? The decision had already been made. There was nothing she could have said to change it. She got up quietly and left the common room. She was especially worried about... No. Stop it. The guard. What worried her the most were the people leaving with Ito. Heisuke and Saito. Would she ever get to see them again? Was this goodbye? She wanted to know what they were thinking. Were they still around? As she stood up to go look for them, she spotted Yamazaki walking towards her.
怪我をしたそうだな。もういいのか？東堂さんと斉藤さんか。
His expression turned grim at the mention of their names. It was quite clear how he felt about the men who'd chosen to leave the Shinsengumi with Ito. She quickly turned to leave, but he held out a hand to stop her.
境内だ。そっちに行くのをさっき見かけた。
Her voice came out more cheerful than she'd intended, but he didn't seem to notice.
話をするなら早い方がいい。彼らがここから出て行ったら、それも許されなくなる。
There they were.
はは、やっぱ捕まっちまったか。んなことないって。俺もちゃんと話したいって思ってたからさ。
The smile he gave her was strained.
やはり来たか。話があるなら早く済ませてくれ。
She wanted to know why they were leaving Shinsengumi, of course, and why they had decided to go. They were going to follow Ito.
理由か。
He scrunched up his face and scratched nervously at the side of his nose.
伊藤さんはそもそも同じ流派の先輩だし、あの人が新選組に入ったのは俺が誘ったのがきっかけだったわけだしさ。だから一緒に行動する義務があるんじゃないかなってそう思ったんだよ。
Heisuke had always struck her as kind, so it was no surprise that he felt he couldn't abandon Ito.
いきなり伊藤派だとか言われて、確かに俺もちょっと動揺してるんだけどさ。けど俺の考えはもともとは尊王攘夷だし、俺さ、幕府の組織っていうんじゃなくて伊藤さんの言う御領絵師の方が合ってる気がするんだ。
Then what he was saying was that while he and Kondo might agree on nationalism, they differed too much in regard to Emperor and the Shogun. She couldn't really think of anything to say, so she kept her mouth shut. After a moment, he continued.
俺だって本当はみんなとずっとバカ騒ぎしてたかったさ。今までずっと一緒だったもんな。
His gaze had drifted off into the distance. There was something in his profile that seemed almost heartbreakingly lonely, but his mouth was a hard line. His mind was made up. She looked up at him.
自らの志にそぐうと感じて伊藤派に属することに決めた。ああ、 近藤さんや土方さんは間違っている。今のまま上位を幕府に任すことはできない。
Saito nodded.
それもやむを得ないだろう。志の前には新選組大使とのこれまでの情も全て切り捨てるつもりだ。
Man, this is a really tough decision. I mean, obviously we want them to stay. There's no question about that. But with the way that it was never even said to her beforehand, and they just heavily avoided it, I'm gonna have to go with betrayed. It hadn't been her intent, but when her mouth opened, all that came out with accusations. The look he gave her nearly broke her heart, and in that moment, she suddenly understood how he felt. He was suffering too, perhaps just as much as she was. And yet she'd said such horrible things.
いや、こっちこそごめんな。じゃあな。
And then he was gone. She was left with an apology still forming on her lips. How could she have been so inconsiderate?
ずっと一緒に頑張ってきたから、だからこれから先も一緒にか。お前は志がどうだろうと行動を共にし続けるべきだというのか。情に流されて己のなすべきことを見失う。それでは本末転倒だろう。しない。務めであれば仲間であろうと切る。そこには何のためらいもない。
Was duty the only function of a member of the Shinsengumi? Did they exist only to fulfill that duty, at the exclusion of everything else? That seemed awfully, horribly sad. She wanted to speak, to tell Saito how she felt, but she knew that no matter what she said, it would simply slide off him, unacknowledged and unwelcome. Saito, for his part, said nothing. They stood silently for a moment, until he moved towards one of the many blossoming cherry trees that covered the temple grounds.
何度目だろうな。こうして今日で見る桜も。
It must have been her imagination, but she could have sworn Saito's face, as he looked at the blossoms above him, was sad.
時が移ろう中で、さまざまなものが変わってゆく。世の動きも思想も、そしてこの新選組も。
He reached out gently and let a single petal fall into his palm. For several moments, he simply looked at it. He looked up. Their eyes met. He didn't answer, only gazed quietly up at the cherry blossoms. His mind had been made up long ago. There was nothing she could say that would change it now.
それでも 何もかもが変わってしまうわけじゃない。
She was surprised, not by his words, but by the small smile that had appeared with them.
時代の移り変わりとともに変わるものもあれば変わらないものもある。そして俺は変わらないものをこそ信じている。そう、変わらないものだ。
And that somehow meant that he should go with Ito. It didn't make any sense. What Saito believed in was something else. She didn't know what yet, but she could feel it. So long as he didn't change, so long as he was still the man who would look at cherry blossoms and smile, then perhaps it was okay. Even if he was far away, perhaps their hearts could still feel the presence of the other. It was sad to think that he would no longer be nearby, but「
別に構わないが、どうするつもりだ、こんなもの。
a reminder every time with him.
おかしなやつだな。だがいいだろう。ほら。
Her wound had completely healed soon afterward, but she kept the bandages on. She got plenty of questions about how she was recovering, and the best she could do was nod, smile, and assure them she was totally fine. The truth was, she didn't even have a scar. She couldn't have pointed out where on her arm she'd been cut if someone had asked her. When Ito and his followers, now the guardians of the Imperial Tomb, left, the compound seemed suddenly very empty. She felt like the Shinsengumi was falling apart around her. There was nothing she could do to stop it. Was this nothing more than a natural result of the Shinsengumi's growth, or the harbinger of something far greater and more terrible? And so we shall go to sleep. Until next time, bye-bye.